Well, so much for being here. I kind of feel like a lot of those late night hosts have the problem where you're standing up in front of an audience presenting, and like suddenly there's no audience to play off of. So I may ramble off the topic. So again, as Sheila said, please put any questions you have along the way into that chat box while we go through. I'm actually here. I'm excited. I'm in my office. I'm the archivist here, so I'm in charge of historic documents and photographs. And because we are basically approaching the centennial of women's right to vote, we thought it would be nice to give everyone a little bit of history, give a little bit of local connection. This is so abbreviated. I mean, there's obviously bazillions of books and movies and webinars and all kinds of things that you can read about the history of women's suffrage. So this is just kind of a nice brief overview, but with a couple of little highlights of people who either lived here in Massillon or perhaps kind of came through Massillon in their lifetimes. So I'll start us off with a little did you know? And this comes from the Ohio suffragecentennial.com. They have a lot of great did you know. So basically, why is Ohio so very important? There's so many great things. So did you know that the 1848 National Convention of Black Freemen was the very first national convention to allow women's participation, and that it was held in Cleveland? So women actually being able to get up and speak was a big deal, participating in a convention. In the 1850 Ohio Women's Convention at Salem was the first convention to be run and entirely organized by women. Yay! Super great. That's a very big moment in Ohio history. A lot of times in history classes, we'll talk about Sojourner Truth. She was a freed slave. Her Ain't I a Woman speech, and that was actually given in Akron, Ohio, at one of the women's rights conventions. The governor who actually gave women full right to vote, full suffrage in Wyoming when they became a state in the 1860s, actually really took that to heart when he visited the Salem Convention as a teenager. So that's because of stuff that happened here in Ohio, he gave women the right to vote in 1869 in Wyoming. And the first female candidate for president of the United States was born in Homer, Ohio. And we'll actually talk quite a bit about her here very shortly. That would be Victoria Claflin Woodhall. So some very, very cool things and connections to Ohio. Obviously, I can't cover everything, so I'll show you things that make sense to me and are entertaining and have a local connection. So this is the most boring screen of my entire presentation, and I'm not sure why. So sorry, it's like so white space, but here we go. So thinking back to the beginnings of women's suffrage in the United States in the early 1800s, as well as into the 1830s and 40s, a lot of the women's rights ideas came out of the abolition movement. So women were basically shouting that slavery is wrong. We really would like to end this, and as a result, they were getting up, they were speaking, they were being listened to. They realized they had a voice for the first time, maybe in their lives. As women didn't have the right to own property, typically some sort of an arranged marriage situation, and then your only job became having and raising children, keeping a household. So women realized that they had something beyond just those things that happened within the home and their moral home sphere that they were in charge of. The women's rights movement was also at some point in time attached to the temperance movement. So what it always seems like to me is that there are some bad experiences with someone in their life had to have been an alcoholic, and the bad things that went along with that. And so trying to ban all alcohol. What's interesting is that the anti-alcohol and women's right to vote actually got passed basically at the same time with the 18th and 19th Amendment in the 1920s. So it's kind of interesting that they both, took that long to finally pass. And luckily, women's right to vote did not get removed, but the prohibition of alcohol did get removed. So you've got anti-slavery, you've got rights for women, you've got anti-drinking, and it's really hard to sell people on all three of those things. Somebody might be anti-slavery, but let's not give women the right to vote, or I totally agree on the alcohol question, but not the slavery question. So a lot of times there'll be a lot of different factions that happen within the movement, and they kind of splinter off, or they add, things to it. So, a lot of things happening, but all three of these movements were getting, started at the same time. So it's important to point out too that typically when we see anti-slavery sentiments in a community, we typically see women's rights activists as well. So here in Massillon, Ohio, there were a lot of very, very important and prominent folks who were against slavery, and they were against the Fugitive Slave Act, which said any runaway had to legally be returned to their owner. So there were many stops on the Underground Railroad here in Massillon, as well as many folks who had, who fled and actually found jobs and lives here, who then, after this act came in, were afraid that they were going to be actually dragged back to slavery. So, again, once you see, kind of anti-slavery sentiments, you typically see, advocates for women's right to vote as well. So there were several anti-slavery conventions. There was one held here in Massillon in 1847. It sounds like it might have just been like a one-off lecture moment. Not sure who exactly spoke. I know that later Lucretia Mott did speak here, probably about anti-slavery in 1847. So, at this time, there wasn't something like this where we can stream something across the world. You had to take the speakers kind of on a tour across the state to places that they would be welcome. But Massillon is on the list of places that they visited, so there had to be a reason for that. So we were sentimental to these causes. Excuse me. So the idea of bringing women's rights, and actually holding conventions here in the United States really came from Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They had visited the World Anti-Slavery Convention in England, and they were actually excluded from saying anything. And I don't even know that they were allowed in to even watch the proceedings. So why were women not allowed? That's not very fair. So they realized once they came back here, they were also not allowed to have really a platform to speak. You couldn't really just go up to the Senate and start testifying or stating your case. So how do we get women a voice? That was very, very important. So Lucretia Mott was actually related to several residents of Massillon. Her parents had actually potentially lived here for about a year in Kendall, Ohio, which is now our northeast section. And she was related to Robert Folger, who was a lawyer here in town. So he more than likely, as an anti-slavery advocate stationed on the Underground Railroad, definitely wanted his aunt to come in and deliver this lecture. So what is so cool, I'm also a photography nerd, so Lucretia Mott had her portrait taken here in Massillon by Abel Fletcher, who was a photographer, the photography pioneer of the United States. And while she was here, she had her portrait taken, but we've never been able to see it until a couple years ago. I was able to connect with a gentleman who is somehow distantly related, and he actually gave us this picture of Lucretia Mott that was kind of taken from the original photograph. So really kind of like the youngest portrait of Lucretia Mott that I've seen, keeping in mind that photography wasn't really prevalent until the 1840s and 50s. So like right around this time, this is like the birth of photography. So, these would be probably one of the earlier portraits of Lucretia Mott. So yay. And also then on the right there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I always love to see, they make women's rights activists out to be, scary, horrifying creatures, because of course it's easier to be scared of a suffragette if she's scary, but there is a sweet lady who just wants the right to speak, and she's with her child, and I think that's a very sweet portrait of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So these are the two kind of founders of the movement in the United States. So they decide to get together, and in 1848, they host the Seneca Falls Convention and basically come up with a Declaration of Independence for women, kind of laying out their plan. Nothing too radical. Basically, we would like the right to vote. We would like the right to speak at conventions. Here's where we're going to go from here. But that's a pivotal moment. So that's an actual convention. People show up. People are hearing about it. And it starts to become part of people's consciousness. Of course, I skipped that screen weirdly. So as I said, so Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton having, kind of organized the Seneca Falls, and then they kind of go out to deliver lectures to people. I was super excited to see that there was documentation of Lucretia Mott actually coming through Massillon, thanks to the diary of Arvine C. Wales, who was living at the Spring Hill home at the time. So while I'm not sure quite exactly where she delivered the lecture, I'm presuming the Tremont Hall would be this building that I'm showing here. It was on Tremont and Erie. It was a hotel at the time, and it was the Tremont House. So I'm assuming there was a hall within the Tremont House, so the Tremont Hall would be what would be called. Obviously later it became a cigar factory, and the building is no longer standing, but this would have been the place to go for really cool lectures. Boop. So another very important person in the women's rights movement is Susan B. Anthony. And Anthony and Stanton really got together, and they were the main powerhouse, behind the whole movement. The convention was stated to be a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. So to discuss all of those different aspects, where are we, where would we like to go? So after this, again, people starting to realize, like, yeah, hey, wait, I don't get to speak in church, or I can't go to work after I'm a mother. Like, maybe there are things that I want out of life beyond just being, sorry to put it this way, a baby factory, to just continually, make children, raise children, take care of the household. So go beyond that. So one of the biggest things that really restricts women and their rights are their clothing. So if you think about it, a corset, that's keeping your figure super great and is restricting you all day long. You've got petticoats, you've got undergarments, you've got all of these things. Pants were like, hey, men get to wear them, why can't we? So Amelia Bloomer, who was also from Seneca Falls and became a large portion of the women's rights movement, borrowed this idea from a friend that, hey, we could put a skirt over top of pants so it doesn't look so far out there that men won't accept it. But these became known as the Bloomers after Amelia Bloomer. And they really allowed women to move better. I'm assuming they still had corsets underneath, but, they didn't have, these thousands and thousands of yards of fabric and hoop skirts and all the things. So on the left there, we have Frances Upham Jarvis from the collection of the Massillon Museum. And this is like around the Civil War era, 1860s. So many layers and hats and gloves and things. And then on the right there, Mary Walker. She was the only female Medal of Honor recipient during the Civil War. She was out there medically caring for everyone, and she's wearing pants. So it's obviously for being out on a battlefield, that would make a whole lot of sense. You don't have a lot of time to have a hoop skirt and yards of fabric when you're trying to treat people medically. So here we are, kind of a transition into what would become legitimate pants. Obviously, this was not well received by men or women. And what's always interesting to me is that it's not always just the men who say, like, you can't wear pants. Sometimes it's we as women who have conventions who kind of like attack the other women who are trying to be different. So, we actually keep each other, in those cages a little bit too. So I'm presuming it was a lot more from the women that, you're not being conventional. So they really did take this, when you think of the head of a household, who wears the pants in the family, the pants were kind of seen as like the power. So what will men wear when women wear the pants? Oh my gosh, she's trying to steal your pants. What will happen? You can clearly see you'll have to take care of the children, and you'll be, kind of demasculized. Some scare tactics to play on the men to remind them that if we give women the right to vote or any of these rights, that it's not long until she takes over. So pants, terribly scary. But I'd like to say thank you, Amelia Bloomer, because I really like wearing my pants. So the other thing too, as the century carried on, you've got transportation. So, women's ability to move and walk being hampered by these dresses, but also bicycle riding. How on earth are you supposed to bicycle ride in a skirt? You can't. Also kind of the same with riding horses. You had to ride side saddle because your skirt was too big. So a lot of, making women dainty, and they can't really ride fast on a horse because they're riding side saddle, and they couldn't bicycle. So a lot of these things were meant to free women, to allow them to do things better. So for what that's worth, Pans and Bloomers. I forgot to mention, so sorry, that photograph on the left there, that is actually a set of bloomers that is from the Massillon Museum's collection. And I'm still trying to track down how exactly it would have been obtained in the early 1850s. But we dated it to about 1851. We had a lot of women who were women's rights activists here. Amelia Bloomer did eventually move to Mount Vernon, Ohio. So it's possible that by proximity, the person who wore this would have contacted her, but it was owned by Ella Zerb, or Zerby. Again, it's always weird to pronounce things you've only seen in text. But her family was kind of connected in with coal and iron, so they were potentially well-to-do. And so a really great example of bloomers that have survived really well over the years. So another person who is not from here but came to here, who's very important, is Betsy McCullough. And I'm going to drink some water, so one moment. That photograph, unfortunately not in our collection, comes from the Los Angeles County Museum. Was taken by our photographer Abel Fletcher here in the 1840s. Cowles was one of the original female graduates of the Oberlin Institute, kind of the first place to allow women to actually come and study in college. Again, kind of one of those things that women didn't go to become educated. So here we are making a difference. Thank you, Oberlin. And then she was also one of the first teachers at Massillon Union School when it opened in 1848. So that is the school there. Today it is the site of the Salvation Army here in Massillon. And those are the original teaching staff there below, with Superintendent Thomas Harvey on the left. So the unfortunate part, so basically, Massillon has this very interesting thing. We were super into the Underground Railroad and freeing slaves, helping them to freedom, employing them once they got here. But after they got here, there were, there's Black students in the same classroom, and it was allowed here in Massillon unless the voters had an issue. And unfortunately, there's a huge petition to remove those students from the classroom. So it's like we're like, yes, equality, but except in the classroom or when we have to share things. It's a very odd history. So Betsy had actually encouraged her several students who were Black in her classroom to stay there until they were actually forcibly removed from the classroom. So she fought very hard for those Black laws to be removed, but to no avail. So she said, forget that, and she moved on, and she would eventually become the superintendent of schools, and I'm not going to remember which school district it is up north. But she became very, very important in the women's rights movement, and really helped to organize several of these conventions that we'll be talking about. So as far as locally in Ohio, the very first Ohio-centric women's rights convention was held in 1850 at Salem, Ohio. This was the site where it was held. Betsy McCullough was in attendance, and because she was such a wonderful speaker, she was elected president to preside over this convention, and again wanted to put forth these women's rights to kind of add to the Ohio Constitution and kind of set these in stone that women in fact are equal, and here's why. The following year, she attended the Akron Women's Rights Convention, and she was named to the Ohio Women's Rights Association later. So the next year, the conference was held in Akron, Ohio, and I haven't read a whole lot about all of the things that happened in Akron, but I can tell you, again, we discussed it at the top, that Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech was delivered in Akron, Ohio. So a lot of these conferences were held, with several hundred people. The numbers grew over the years, so it's gaining popularity. Obviously, people found something in these conventions that resonated with them. So I'm very proud to say that Massillon did host one of these conventions in 1852. This sketch shows downtown Massillon in the 1840s, and it was done by Henry Howe, who traveled all across Ohio and kind of sketched out the towns that he thought were important, so we made the list. We don't really know what building the convention was held in. It literally just says a Baptist church, and I've tried several different ways, several different methods to figure out what that is. But as far as I can tell, those buildings on the right there, the one that says cheap, those would have been more than likely the buildings that they were held in. That was the commercial inn that was run by the Folger family, who, they had stops on the Underground Railroad. They were related to Lucretia Mott. So more than likely that, it was kind of one of those multi-purpose buildings. You've got a hotel, you've got a business, you've got some meeting rooms upstairs. So that really kind of makes the most sense. Sometimes they loan it out to church groups to meet. So that's about the best I can do. So the important thing to come out of the Massillon Convention is that they actually decided to create an actual Ohio Women's Rights Association to actually give ourselves a full, state group. So one of the most important people as far as like archival material that we have is Caroline McCullough Everhard. So she, as a child, actually attended Lucretia Mott's lecture in Massillon. I mean, she was incredibly young, but she attended it. She was a student of Betsy McCullough's at Union School during her time here. So a lot of good exposure very early for Caroline to, absorb the good message of women's rights. So she later became an activist. She fought for women's rights and would serve as the president of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association many times over. Her hugest achievement was that she worked with the government, and at the time, I believe he was still governor, Governor William McKinley, who lived just down the road in Canton and would visit Massillon very often. Between the two of them, they worked to get women the right to vote on school issues. So you could kind of make the argument that like maybe women don't understand politics or good roads bills, but they know a little bit something of school board issues because that deals with children. And then she kind of pushed the envelope a little further and said, and they should be able to vote for their city council people, the mayor, local issues. They might not understand what's happening in Washington, but maybe their city. So unfortunately, she did not get that passed here in Ohio, but she did get the school board issue passed. So So that was great. So that, led the way for women to actually have a say in their local school issues. So I listed there all of the things. This is not even the full list of what she achieved during her lifetime, but she served on the Charity School of Kendall Board. She was a founding member of the Massillon Humane Society, a founding member of the Massillon High School Alumni Association, and one of the early serving board members at the McCullough Public Library, which is now the Massillon Public Library. So she was incredibly prominent, but also using her wealth and influence for the good. So, so some really, really good things that she achieved. Now, the reason that we know all this, and the thing that makes it so very exciting, is that we have 5 of her scrapbooks. And I'm happy to say that these are digitized and available, and I will give you the link here in a second. There it is. I don't know if you can see it there at the bottom. Let's see. You can't. Okay. But it says massmu.org/women's suffrage, and there are links to all of the different resources that we have at this time. So luckily, a lot of people saved pamphlets, saved newsletters. Caroline pasted a lot of letters into these what look like account books, but she reused them as scrapbooks. So a lot of wonderful material. So many original signed letters. This was one by Susan B. Anthony. We've got letters from Catherine Catt, and so many good things. So you are welcome to peruse those at your leisure. Use them as resources. There's all kinds of wonderful stuff to be found inside of them. So this is the official newspaper clipping. And that was the other great thing, is that she clipped all the newspaper articles she could possibly find that dealt with women's suffrage. So really her view of what she was reading about and what her understanding was of everything. So this is, as she was the president of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association, she's speaking about the passage of the ability to vote in school issues. Quote, "The women of Ohio have demonstrated that women can enter politics successfully and without loss of dignity or self-respect. The experience of one campaign has settled the school suffrage issue for all time to come. We are now looking into the future, hopeful of adding to our present privileges and in good time to come of sharing political responsibility equally with men. It is not true that we propose to ask for municipal suffrage at the hands of the next assembly. Under the present constitution of power of the legislature is very, very limited. We shall offer a bill in the next session." So obviously pushing for that municipal suffrage, not quite there yet, but very, very exciting that they at least got that far. I believe Elizabeth Folger was one of the first women actually elected to the school board in 1895 here in Massillon. So some great things. Sadly for Caroline McCullough Everhard, she died in 1902, and she did not get to see us actually get full suffrage, but obviously she achieved a lot in her time. So I'm gonna grab some more water. Awesome. Oh, hey, I just saw Alice Paul. Thank you. Yeah, three sweet scrapbooks. Awesome, good things. The other great materials that are online are Ella Shoemaker, and I'm not sure what role she played, but she saved every single pamphlet, talking about various female legislators and, getting the right to vote, and then after the right to vote, and every single magazine on the back of it had a sheet for you to tear off and get more information as to how to actually register to vote. So some really great archives. This is why I do what I do, because these are the fun things that I get to work with every day and share. Excuse me, goodness. So this is definitely one of our kind of prized possessions here at the museum. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to lecture at our opera house, her lecture was called Our Girls. And unfortunately, I don't know what was actually contained within that lecture, but it's a broadside poster that we have on display. Unfortunately, we are currently closed to the public until we're not sure when, depending on when the governor allows museums to open back, but it is ready to go, and it is on the wall, ready to be seen. So a very, very cool broadside. So then we get to the scandal. So I'm going to reference my notes a little bit because there's just so much in Victoria that is awesome. So Victoria was born in Homer, Ohio, and her family was large. There were a lot of children. And from everything that I've read, they basically were not like drifters or gypsies, but they traveled a lot. They were sometimes kicked out of town for things that they said, you know, kind of migrating from town to town. And they did actually live in Massillon for a period of time. But they boasted that they could speak to the dead. They boasted snake oil, you know, cure-all medications that you could take easily, magnetic healing, fortune telling, massage, you know, you name it. They boasted that they could make that happen. So they traveled through Massillon, and eventually, when Victoria was, I think, 15, she was married off to Mr. Woodhall. And I don't know, that is not okay. A 15-year-old, that sounds like a terrible time to get married. And it did not go very well. And she did actually eventually divorce him. So there's like 2 strikes against her, like, you know, advocating for not so savory things. And she's a divorcee. So, you know, what are we going to do? So she and her sister, Tennessee, actually moved to New York, and in 1868 they obtained the backing of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who at the time I believe was looking for someone to speak to the other side and you know, speak to some of his relatives who had passed on. And they must have impressed him because he helped them to actually launch the very first female stock brokerage firm in New York through the stock market. So that was pretty incredible. They also started Woodhall and Claflin's weekly newspaper. So they had all kinds of information in there about women's rights. The bad part is that they you know, were mailing out this newspaper, and they advocated for free love, basically saying what happens in my bedroom is none of your business. But that was seen as very scandalous, and she did actually, I believe, go to jail for mailing out these obscenities through the mail. So, the newspaper was also the place that they announced Victoria Claflin Woodhall would be a nominee for President of the United States in 1871, with the election coming up in 1872. So, super, super cool that they actually have saved all of these newspapers. Her vice president was to be Frederick Douglass. So here we have a woman and an African American, and they are both running against Ulysses S. Grant. So that's cool. That's totally going to work out. The unfortunate part, I'm sure she could have gained a little bit more traction. Obviously, I don't think that was going to happen in 1872, regardless of who her you know, running mate was. Douglass didn't realize what exactly her free love platform was, and really kind of turned away from actually participating once he figured out what all she was espousing. She did actually get into the Judiciary Committee and argued for suffrage in front of Congress. I believe she was the first woman to do so. But yeah, every time she said the word free love, it was like everybody just shut her down. She was initially supported by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton until all of these things, you know, she pushed the envelope a little too far, and they decided maybe not so much. So she kind of broke with the party. So again, this free love idea, this is clearly like not acceptable at the time. So she's depicted as Mrs. Satan. I love this illustration so much. So there's a woman back there. She's got an alcoholic husband that she's carrying around the burden of him, you know, physically in this picture. she's got so many children, and she's clearly, you know, run down. So she's a mom of children. She's got an alcoholic husband, but like, I'm not going to prescribe to your, you know, evil free love thoughts. So very interesting. Again, this was done by Thomas Nast, who is the guy who made Santa Claus, like the Santa Claus that we all go back to, you know, that imagery of, same cartoonist. So interesting. So Mrs. Woodhall, of course, asserting her right to vote. She did go and cast a ballot. Obviously, did not go well for her. Interestingly, she was in jail on election day, and probably for this moment. And again, they were running against Ulysses S. Grant. She was reportedly not even old enough. I think she was 32, and the minimum age for presidency was 35. So there were a few factors working against her, you know, to actually become the first woman president in 1872. And there's President Ulysses S. Grant, who we know won. So another thing that is always so interesting in, you know, speaking about women's rights and, you know, all of these people who, who are a part of, you know, advocating for it, balancing the home life, because everyone's always so scared that these activists going out, you know, are just completely forgetting their children, or they're not taking care of X, Y, and Z in the house. So it's really important, you know, to show that a lot of these activists, this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, like their children turned out okay, their household was okay, it was fine. You know, the whole house doesn't immediately fall apart just because women go out and, you know, wear bloomers. So it's always an important theme to watch out for, that they really play on this idea. So, you know, towards the late 1800s and the early 1900s, you know, they keep trying for this women's right to vote, and it still hasn't gone well. So we have to really kind of like launch some propaganda to, you know, make the men understand how dangerous the suffrage movement really is. So I absolutely love these, because that just currently, you know, present day, 2020, my husband is at home right now taking care of my 1-year-old. And I showed him these and said, like, is this accurate? And he said, well, I'm not that grumpy about it. I'm enjoying it, and we're a team. You know, and here I am at work wearing pants. So, you know, a lot has changed since the early 1900s. But you can see these men, obviously, they want to show them that if you give women the right to vote, they might take away your right to vote. You know, they're going to feminize you. They're going to, you know, take away your masculinity. So interesting, and so scared of what might happen if we gave women the right to vote. So these are items in our collection here at the Massillon Museum. There at the top is definitely one of the most awesome things. It is a satin sash that is inscribed with votes for women. It's framed to keep it as safe as possible, because satin is the hardest thing to keep well preserved over time, especially, you know, 100 and some years later. We have 2 votes for women buttons in the collection. There are some great pamphlets online, so please check those out. A lot of great materials on there. And then obviously a reminder that women bring all voters into the world, so we should probably have the right to vote, and anyone who's ever had children or had to put up with children should totally understand that. And don't get me wrong, I do love my child. So this was kind of interesting, the kind of wave of suffrage. So as in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, as states were added to the country of the United States, they typically gave women the right to vote as they were founded. So, you know, as we talked about in Wyoming in 1869, full women's suffrage upon their entry into the Union. So all of these states on the Western coast, you know, giving women the right to vote. So it's like, oh, it's only a matter of time before we all have the right to vote, right? So they started putting amendments to the Constitution in 1878. That's when they actually started to petition Congress for the right to vote. And, come up every couple of years, it would get shut down, they'd bring it back up. And it really wasn't until we got to World War I that it finally got pushed to the forefront. So here we are in the midst of a global war for the first time, the biggest war, Great War, World War I. And, women are asked to come into the munition factories, how unfeminine, leave the home to go work in a factory. They're fighting and dying beside everyone. Women are going across the ocean to be nurses. And, how do you then justify that we can't have a right to vote? Like we have a say now, in what happens in this war effort. So you really, really should give us the right to vote. So unfortunately, it took a lot of hunger strikes, and beatings and arrests, until, women's voices were finally heard. So, I do definitely appreciate what the women did, to make this actually possible. When in 1917, there was a Russian delegation visiting the White House, and they unfurled a banner that said, "We women of America tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement." So, here we are, we're fighting across the ocean. All of our boys are dying in France so that we can give rights to people in Europe, but women here at home still don't have the right to vote. So it kind of became obvious that, like, if all the women who are here working in the munitions factories and on the farms were to strike, like, that would be very bad. So, the movement really kind of picked up steam. They were passing out information. This one's great. This was in Cleveland, sharing with men why it's a good idea to give women the right to vote. And obviously some people took a very angry stance. So in World War I, we were fighting Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Germany kind of became the main opponent that we looked to be the bad guy. So here this lady is attacking President Wilson, so calling him Kaiser Wilson. That would really definitely catch your attention. So here we are, again, fighting for other people, and we don't even have the right to vote here in our own country. So they were outside the White House quite often, especially during World War I, asking for the right to vote and to be equals. I see that there, Alice Paul. Yes, violating the Sedition Acts. So yeah, during World War I, the unfortunate part is that's always the time that things like the First Amendment get thrown out the window, but those are exactly the moments when we need those. So any person who said anything bad about the war or the president or the United States was able to be just thrown in jail for an undocumented amount of time, because Wilson wanted everybody to be so invested in, in this effort, and that nobody could say anything bad. So here are all these women out there saying bad things, and that's when a lot of those women got arrested. So obviously he changed his mind and realized that this public outcry for the right to vote, we should probably take care of this. So as you see there, as a war measure, the women are asked to do all of those things in the list, and all we're asking for is the right to vote. So could we just have that, please? So women's protest marches all across the country, especially in DC. So President Wilson says it's finally time to support women's suffrage. Yay! So the 19th Amendment itself prohibits state or federal sex-based restrictions on voting. Again, it was first submitted to Congress in 1878 and finally passed in both houses of Congress in 1919. We didn't officially obtain the right to vote until it was ratified in 1920, Tennessee being the state that kind of sealed the deal. You have to have a certain number of states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. I believe the last state to ratify this was something like Mississippi in the 1980s. So, they're still out there not quite agreeing with women's right to vote, but we have that right. And similarly, I believe it was last year, the Virginia State Legislature finally passed the Equal Rights Amendment, just basically saying that like women are people too. They finally passed it like last year. So some weird things, some interesting things. And sometimes if it's left on the back burner and you don't think about it, and then it becomes the 80s and you're like, hey, we should probably pass that eventually. So so here we are. So we are celebrating 100 years of having the right to vote. You know, nothing terrible happened as a result. I feel like, you know, now that we have the right to vote, you know, not every man is forced to wear a dress, and you know, just because I'm wearing pants today does not mean that the whole world will suffer. So so it's a big time. There are a lot of celebrations happening, and I encourage you to see what events, what lectures. Obviously, a lot of them will be online like this. Will happen throughout this year. There's a lot of great things happening. Specifically, want to thank the League of Women Voters because they were founded about this time to help educate women. Like, you know, who am I supposed to vote for? Who believes what? And every single year when I vote, I actually refer to their nonpartisan pamphlet to help inform me as a voter. And to any woman who ever says like, oh, I don't think I'll vote this election. I think my husband said that to me once. He's like, man, I'll just skip out on it. I was like, listen, there are some women who died and were arrested and force-fed in jail for my right to vote. And so I'm absolutely voting in every election that I am able to vote in. So, so yes, a woman living here has been registered to vote because it's a responsibility of citizenship. So have your voice heard, please. Whoever you're voting for, I don't care who you're voting for, just make your voice heard. So there you are. There's the very, very top level overview of women's right to vote. Are there any questions? I have my chat window up over here.
Okay, thank you so much, Mandy. That was a fantastic presentation. So I really appreciate it. And I suppose I can even turn my video back on. Thank you so much.
Pose of people in the one school staff photo.
Thinking the school that began integrated.
Do you want me to go back to that, Sarah? Is that? Oh yeah. Do you want me to go back? I'll go back. Or maybe I won't. Maybe it'll freeze instead. There you go. That one. All right. A tableau vivant. Yeah, it's such a weird photo, right? So I'm presuming, again, at this time period, the photographer in town was Abel Fletcher. So he seemed to have a pretty artistic handle on stuff. Maybe it definitely looks like it should be like a classical painting or something. So maybe, I don't know, maybe one of them suggested it, or maybe Abel Fletcher suggested it. But yeah, it's such a weird. And I hate that the menfolk are in profile. Like, I want to see your face, guys. And I want them to be identified, but they're not all identified. So.
Okay. Were there other questions?
Thanks, Sarah. Cool, Alice. It sounds like you're a teacher who uses some of these same cartoons in class, so that's pretty cool. There's so much cool material out there. I mean, propaganda is like the most amazing cool stuff to look at and see what people's fears were and what they actually played on, you know, trying to justify their point of view. Awesome. I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Well, again, thank you so much, Mandy, for doing this, and thank you all for coming. Have a good evening.